Today we're going to talk about close reading, and I want you to start by thinking about close reading as repeated readings of the same text. We're going to start with just 3 reads, or 3 phases, 3 drafts of a reading of a text, and it might take 5 readings of a text or rereadings. So this isn't to say that you will only read a text 3 times, but we're going to start with that. The first read is always at a literal level. What does the text say? The second read, how does the text say it? So you reread the text to see how the writer puts the pieces together. And the third reading gets at a deeper level of comprehension. You look at the bigger picture, you zoom out. What does the text mean? So for 3 readings that we'll start with, you read it first, take a literal reading, you zoom in, and then you zoom out. You're going to be using a TPCast kind of poetry booklet at the start of this unit and even as we get into The Great Gatsby later. This booklet will just help you keep everything in one place. So let's think about the TPCast graphic organizer in relation to these repeated readings. When you do your first reading and you're looking at the literal level, essentially you'll read the title and make a prediction in your mind or on paper. What could the poem be about based on the title? Then you will paraphrase what's literally happening in the poem. For the second reading, you want to look deeper into the poem and see how it works. So you will look at connotation and devices that the writer uses. You'll look at the poet or the speaker's attitude within the poem and any shifts that you encounter. So you're getting at the how is meaning made in the poem in that section of the organizer. And your third reading of the piece brings you back to the title to reconsider it and has you zoom out to think about theme, the message that the author wants us to take away from the text. So those are our 3 readings connected to the TPCast organizer that you'll use. So let's try this with Billy Collins's poem, Introduction to Poetry. When I read that title, I figure that this is going to be about poetry, right? I'm not sure who's going to be introducing whom to poetry, but let's see. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So it is about poetry, and I see 2 groups, and here it could be, it's the I and the them. And as I read this could be the teacher and students. And their task is to make meaning from a poem, which is exactly what we're doing. So here it seems as if this is how the teacher wants it in these first several stanzas. We've got how many stanzas? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So he wants to explore like on a slide and listen to the poem, the hive, listen to the buzz of the hive, and the hive gun is going to represent the poem. Explore the poem as if you're a mouse, go inside the poem's room, look at the surface of the poem, so surface, all of these things. This is how the teacher wants the students to look at the poem. And this word here, but all they want to do, so this is from the student's perspective, is kind of torture the meaning out of the poem. They want the poem to confess. So here you'll notice that I took just enough notes to help me paraphrase verbally. If this were perhaps a more challenging poem, or I were working in my notebook, I would have written things out, in chunks next to the stanzas. It is a good habit to number the stanzas as you go, just because it makes writing about them easier. So I would recommend you do that when you're taking notes and annotating the poems in your notebook. So we've read the poem for the literal meaning. Let's take a look at it again and read it for devices and connotations. Let's really zoom in on the words and phrases and see what we discover about the next layer of meaning. Okay, so I've already annotated the poem, and let me just zoom in here at the beginning. I see two people in the first stanza, I and them, and they have unique perspectives. I wants them to examine and explore the meaning of a poem. And the I, the speaker of the poem, lays out several ways they would like those others to explore the poem. The first way, the poet uses a simile. He'd like the people to explore the poem as if it's a color slide. Hold it up to the light so the light will illuminate the meaning. So that's a simile there. And then press an ear against its hive. So here, is the poem, is it a bee? Is it a wasp? It's not really compared to a hive, but it's compared to something that would make a hive, right? And in that stanza, that single line stanza, the poet is giving us kind of a sound, like we need to listen to the sound that's coming from that hive or that poem. In the third stanza, the I recommends that students drop a mouse into a poem. So there's an implied metaphor here. Is a poem a maze that a mouse would explore, and probe his way out? In the next stanza, the poem is compared to a room. So that metaphor there is compared to a dark room, and the I, or the teacher, recommends walking inside the dark room of the poem and feeling around for the light switch so that you can again illuminate the meaning of the poem. The last stanza that the I is speaking from is, I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem. So in this stanza, the poem is being compared to a body of water. It could be a lake, right? Or it could be a very calm bay. And in order to get at the meaning, the poet, or the speaker in this poem, recommends that students ski across the surface and kind of wave at the author at the shore. So you're not really investigating the meaning based on what the author says. You're looking just across the surface of the water. And then you'll notice quite a shift. The poet compares the I point of view to what they, or the students, want to do with the poem. And they want to tie the poem up to a chair. So the poem here is a criminal that they're trying to torture a confession out of. So that metaphor at the end there is kind of a violent one. When you think about metaphor, we often consider the tenor and the vehicle. And the tenor is the subject. So here, poetry is the tenor, or a poem is the tenor. And the vehicle is the object that lends attributes to the subject. So in this case, there are several vehicles, right? There's a slide, there's a hive or a bee, there's a maze, and all of these things, there's a lake, all of these things lend attributes to the tenor, which is the subject or the poem. So that's just another way to think about parts of a metaphor that can help you be very specific when you're talking about metaphor. Okay, now let's take another look at the poem in terms of attitude, shifts, and theme. When I think about the attitude, I'm wondering, what's the poet's attitude toward poetry? What do you think the poet's attitude is toward students, or teaching, or reading poetry? So let's just think about that for a minute. I would say that the poet's attitude toward poetry is positive, right? When I look at these stanzas, and this is a positive image of exploration, this is a positive sound, The mouse in a maze is positively framed, as is exploring, the room. So this exploration, the sense of exploration, gives us a positive attitude toward poetry. When I think about the poet's attitude toward students, I've got to consider how the poet keeps, one, holding them kind of at arm's length by calling them, and by having a definite separation between the I and the them. This contrast, but all they want to do, like that use of the word all, suggests kind of a negative attitude toward how the students approach poetry. So I think that I'm just going to use S's, approach poetry there. So it seems as if the poet's attitude towards students beating the poem up and violently trying to determine the meaning is rather negative there. We've already noted the shift, those last two stanzas shift to students, and the beginning part is from the teacher. And you can see, let me just change colors here, I'll use a highlighter. You can see the negative words. You're tying it up with a rope, beating it with a hose. I mean, that's just violent imagery. So there's quite a shift there at the end. So what does that mean for the theme? What's the poet's essential message? If I'm thinking about it, I'm going to say poetry is, according to Billy Collins, poetry is something to be explored and experienced. Poetry is something to shine light into our lives. So that's what I believe Billy Collins is trying to communicate with this poem. Okay, so hopefully you get a sense of the kind of thinking that I'd like you to do with the TPCast pieces in your booklet. We will be using your visible thinking from the booklet during small group discussions so that you all will be able to bring your questions and bring your ideas and your thinking to your small groups as we investigate the meanings of these poems together as we work toward analyzing texts at deeper levels of comprehension.